March 3rd, 1943, the Solomon Islands. A single unauthorized decision in the chaos of war would kill more enemy soldiers in 15 minutes than most battles managed in weeks. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The man who made that call wasn't supposed to be there. He'd already been written off as dead by his own command. His name was Major Ed Larner, and in exactly 72 hours, he would ignore direct orders and unleash hell from the sky in a way that changed naval warfare forever. Before you scroll away, let me ask you something. What would you do if you had 15 minutes to save thousands of your brothers in arms, but taking that shot meant certain court-martial? Hold that thought. And if this story grips you the way it should, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this, true stories that Hollywood keeps getting wrong, they deserve to be shared. So do that, too, right now. Because what happened in those 15 minutes rewrote the rules of engagement. Now, let me take you back 3 weeks earlier to where this really begins. Port Moresby, New Guinea, February 10th, 1943. The Allied forces were hemorrhaging men and machines in the Pacific Theater. Every supply ship that made it through to the Japanese forward bases meant more American boys dying on jungle islands with names they couldn't pronounce. Major Ed Larner stood in a sweltering operations tent, sweat dripping from his nose onto reconnaissance photographs that showed something terrifying. A Japanese convoy of unprecedented size assembling at Rabaul. 16 transport ships, 8 destroyers, carrying an estimated 15,000 troops destined for New Guinea. Intelligence officer Captain James Halloran slid another photograph across the table. They're calling it Operation 81. If that convoy reaches Lae, we lose New Guinea. If we lose New Guinea, Australia's next. Larner had been flying B-25 Mitchell bombers since North Africa, 37 missions, more than any man in his squadron. He'd seen friends spiral into the Mediterranean in flames, watched B-17s break apart over Tunis like paper toys. But this was different. The Japanese were moving with confidence, almost arrogance. "What's 5th Air Force saying?" Larner asked. Halloran's jaw tightened. "General Kenny wants to hit them, hard, but he's getting pushback from MacArthur's staff. Conventional wisdom says high-altitude bombing. Stay at 10,000 feet, drop your payload, pray something hits. Conventional wisdom." Larner lit a cigarette, the match flame steady in his scarred hands. "Conventional wisdom has us hitting water 90% of the time. Ships are too maneuverable. By the time your bombs fall 2 miles, they've moved." "I know," Halloran said quietly. "Kenny knows it too." What neither man said aloud was the math they'd both calculated. At current accuracy rates, they'd need to fly 300 sorties to maybe sink 2 or 3 ships. The convoy would make landfall long before that. Thousands of Japanese soldiers would pour into New Guinea. The war's entire strategic balance in the Pacific would shift. Larner studied the photographs until the cigarette burned his fingers. Somewhere in his mind, an idea was forming. A terrible, beautiful, probably suicidal idea. 3 days later, on a restricted airfield that didn't officially exist on any map, Larner stood before 8 B-25 bombers that had been modified in ways that made visiting generals nervous. The nose guns had been reinforced. Additional forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns bristled from the fuselage. These weren't high-altitude bombers anymore. They were something else, something the manual didn't have a name for yet. "Skip bombing," said Captain Paul "Pappy" Gunn, the maverick engineer who'd overseen the modifications. He was 43, ancient by pilot standards, with oil permanently embedded under his fingernails. "You come in low, wave top low, 50 feet. You're moving 265 miles per hour. You release your bombs so they skip across the water like flat stones. They hit the ship at the waterline, below the armor." "That's insane," said Lieutenant Robert Rhodes, one of Larner's pilots. "The destroyer escorts will tear us apart at that altitude." "That's why we strafe first," Larner said. "Those forward guns, we suppress their anti-aircraft batteries on the approach, clear our own path." Rhodes looked at him like he'd suggested flying blindfolded. "Sir, that's not in any tactical manual. That's not how bombers operate." No, Larner agreed. It's not. For 2 weeks they practiced over the Coral Sea, flying so low the spray coated their windscreens, learning to judge distance and release timing by instinct because there was no mathematics for what they were attempting. 2 planes crashed during training. 5 men died, learning to do something that had never been done before. And then, on March 1st, reconnaissance confirmed it. The convoy was moving. 16 transport ships, heavy with troops and supplies. 8 destroyers running escort, heading straight for Leh. The authorization to attack came through standard channels. High-altitude bombing runs, textbook tactics, safe tactics, ineffective tactics. Larner read the orders twice, then walked out to where his modified B-25s waited like crouched predators in the tropical dawn. The night before the attack, Larner couldn't sleep. The operations tent felt like a coffin, humidity pressing down like wet canvas. He kept seeing the reconnaissance photos, those 16 transport ships arranged in a defensive formation that had protected Japanese convoys for 18 months of unbroken success. By dawn, he'd chain-smoked through his entire week's ration. At 0400 hours, Lieutenant William Ben found him outside, staring at the modified B-25s, silhouetted against the false dawn. Ben was 22, fresh-faced despite 3 months in the Pacific. Still young enough to believe in clean wars and clear orders. "Can't sleep either, sir?" Ben asked. "Thinking about the numbers," Larner admitted. "Intelligence estimates 6,000 troops on those transports, maybe more. If they land at Leh, our boys on the ground are outnumbered 3-1. It'll be a slaughter." Ben nodded slowly. "And if we follow the orders as written, high-altitude bombing? We'll hit ocean, maybe get lucky and damage 1 ship, 2 if God's feeling generous." Larner's voice was flat, factual. "The convoy makes landfall. Maybe we lose 2,000 men in the ground fighting that follows, maybe more." What Larner didn't say, what he couldn't say yet, was that he'd already made his decision. The orders from 5th Air Force headquarters specified attack altitude, 10,000 feet. Bombing, approach, conventional high-altitude pattern. Engagement protocol, avoid direct confrontation with escort destroyers. It was all perfectly reasonable, perfectly safe, perfectly useless. Captain Paul Gunn approached through the darkness, his engineer's mind already 3 steps ahead. Modified the bomb loads on all 8 birds, half conventional bombs, half with 4-second delay fuses for skip bombing. You know, just in case the tactical situation requires flexibility. Larner allowed himself a thin smile. "Flexibility, that what we're calling it?" "Beats calling it career suicide," Gunn said. "Those brass hats at headquarters, they've never been at 50 feet watching their bombs bounce. They don't know what these birds can do." By 0600 hours, the crews were assembled, 24 men across 8 aircraft. Larner looked at their faces, some eager, some terrified, all trying to hide it. These weren't the veteran crews from Europe. Half had less than 10 combat missions. They'd trained for 2 weeks on tactics that didn't exist in any manual, and now their lives depended on it. "Gentlemen," Larner began, his voice carrying across the tarmac, "you've seen the orders. High-altitude approach, textbook bombing run. That's what headquarters wants." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "But I've also seen the intelligence reports they're not sharing with you. That convoy is carrying enough troops to change this entire theater. If they make landfall, we lose New Guinea. Australia becomes indefensible." Rhodes spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Sir, are you saying we're not following the attack plan?" "I'm saying," Larner chose his words carefully, "that circumstances may require tactical adaptation in the field. If visibility conditions or enemy disposition make high-altitude bombing ineffective, flight leaders are authorized to use their judgment." It was beautifully phrased, technically accurate, absolutely insubordinate. "We're going in low," Ben said quietly. It wasn't a question. Larner met his eyes. "If the tactical situation requires it, yes." What followed was a silence heavy with understanding. Every man there knew what low meant. 50 feet, wave-top level. So close they'd see the faces of enemy sailors before they killed them. So close that anti-aircraft fire became personal, gunners aiming at cockpits instead of formations. So close that a single mistake meant cartwheeling into the ocean at 265 miles per hour. Sergeant Donald Reeves, a waist gunner who'd survived Midway, raised his hand. "Sir, what happens when we get back? When headquarters finds out we ignored the attack plan?" "That's on me," Larner said. "Every bit of it. You followed your flight leader's orders under combat conditions. I made the call." But they all knew that was bullshit. Military justice didn't work that way. If this went wrong, if they lost planes and men while violating direct orders, courts-martial would roll downhill. Careers would end. Men might face imprisonment. And if they followed orders, if they stayed at 10,000 feet and bombed blind and watched the convoys sail past their splashes, how many men would die for that obedience? At 07:15 hours, the first B-25 engines coughed to life. The sound was thunder, 8 Wright Cyclone radials hammering the dawn. Larner climbed into the lead aircraft, a Mitchell they'd nicknamed Dirty Dora, her nose bristling with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Samuel Morrison, ran through the pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Morrison was 31, old for a co-pilot, passed over for command twice due to what his evaluation reports politely called insufficient aggressiveness. But Larner had chosen him specifically because Morrison was steady, unflappable, the kind of man who wouldn't panic when the world turned into tracer fire and screaming metal. "Sir," Morrison said as they taxied into position, "I need to ask, are we really doing this?" Larner watched the other 7 B-25s forming up behind him, their modified profiles looking predatory in the early light. "Sam, I've been flying combat missions for 14 months. I've dropped bombs from 10,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet. You know how many ships I've actually hit?" "Sir? None. Not one. Because you can't hit a maneuvering ship from that altitude. The math doesn't work. Physics doesn't work. We might as well be throwing rocks." Larner's hands moved across the controls with practiced ease. "So yeah, we're really doing this, because it's the only thing that might actually work." They lifted off at 07:45 hours. 8 modified B-25s carrying men who just committed to tactics that would either revolutionize aerial warfare or end in a catastrophic court-martial. The new Guinea coast fell away beneath them, jungle giving way to the vast emptiness of the Bismarck Sea. The flight to intercept took 2 hours and 37 minutes, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for Larner to recalculate the odds and find them wanting. 8 modified bombers against 16 transport ships and 8 destroyer escorts. The Japanese vessels bristled with anti-aircraft guns, 25mm Type 96 cannons that could shred a B-25 at close range. At 1022 hours, Bombardier Lieutenant Henry Waskowitz called out from the nose. "Contact! 11 o'clock, 15 miles. Larner banked slightly, and there it was. The convoy spread across the Bismarck Sea like a migration, white wakes trailing behind each vessel. Even from this distance, it looked impossibly large. Intelligence had been accurate. 16 transports arranged in a protective formation. Destroyers prowling the perimeter like wolves guarding sheep. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "That's a lot of ships." Larner keyed the radio. "All aircraft, this is lead. Target confirmed. Begin descent to attack altitude." There was a pause, a heartbeat of hesitation that stretched across the radio frequency. Then, one by one, acknowledgments came back. They were committed now, no turning back. "Attack altitude, sir?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. 50 feet, Larner said. "Skip bombing approach." Morrison's hand hesitated over the radio, the moment hanging between them like a held breath. 50 feet meant violating direct orders, meant courts-martial if they survived, meant revolution if they succeeded. "Confirm altitude," Morrison said into the radio. All aircraft descend to 50 feet. Skip, bombing attack. The 8 B-25s dropped from 7,000 feet like stones. Larner's stomach lurched as the ocean rushed up to meet them, blue-gray water suddenly filling the windscreen. At 200 feet, he began to level off. At 100 feet, the ocean's surface developed texture, waves and swells becoming individual features. At 50 feet, spray began to mist the windscreen. They were so low that the propeller wash left visible trails across the water's surface. The Japanese convoy was 5 miles ahead now, close enough to see the ship's details. Close enough that lookouts on the destroyer Shirayuki spotted them and began signaling frantically. Alarm bells would be ringing on every ship. Gun crews would be sprinting to their stations. Officers would be barking orders, trying to understand why American bombers were approaching at wave-top level like suicidal madmen. "They're signaling," Waskowitz reported from the nose. "Looks like they don't know what to make of us." "Good," Larner said. "Confusion buys us seconds. Arm the forward guns." The B-25's nose bristled with 8 50-caliber machine guns, each one loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Pappy Gun's modifications had turned these bombers into flying gun platforms. The plan was simple, terrifying, and had never been tested in actual combat. Strafe the anti-aircraft positions to suppress defensive fire, then skip your bombs into the ship's waterlines at point-blank range. 3 miles. The convoy was turning, destroyers moving to interpose themselves between the transports and the approaching threat. Standard defensive protocol, textbook tactics. But textbooks assumed bombers would attack from altitude, where speed and maneuverability favored the ships. Nobody had written the textbook for this. 2 miles, Morrison called out, flak opening up. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began to blossom ahead of them, but the Japanese gunners were aiming high, anticipating a normal bombing approach. Their shells were exploding at 3,000 feet, while Larner's formation screamed past at 50. "Adjust fire!" Larner could imagine the Japanese officers screaming it. "They're on the water! Adjust fire!" 1 mile. Now the 25mm cannons opened up, tracer rounds arcing across the water like lethal fireworks. These guns could hit them. At this altitude, at this range, every Japanese gunner became personally deadly. Something hammered against Dirty Dora's fuselage, a sound like hail on a tin roof, shrapnel or small arms fire. The B-25 shuddered but held together. "Half mile," Morrison said, his voice remarkably steady. "Guns ready." Larner could see individual sailors now, tiny figures scrambling across the destroyer Tokitsukaze's deck. Could see the muzzle flashes from their anti-aircraft positions. Could see, with perfect clarity, the moment when the Japanese gunners realized these American bombers weren't pulling up. "Fire," Larner said. 8 50-caliber machine guns opened up simultaneously. The noise was apocalyptic, a hammering roar that shook the entire aircraft. Armor-piercing rounds tore across the Tokitsukaze's superstructure at 2,700 feet per second. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, anti-aircraft crews diving for cover or simply ceasing to exist under the withering fire. Larner was so close he could see the paint peeling on the destroyer's hull, could see a Japanese officer on the bridge, mouth open in a scream that was lost in the chaos, could see the exact moment when the ship's defensive fire slackened, gun crews dead or diving for cover. "Bombs away!" Waskowitz shouted. Larner pulled the release. 4 500-pound bombs dropped free, falling for exactly 2/5 of a second before hitting the water at a shallow angle. The 4-second delay fuses meant they didn't explode on impact. Instead, they skipped, literally bounced across the wave tops like flat stones thrown by a giant. The first bomb skipped once, twice, and slammed into the Tokitsukaze's hull 3 feet above the waterline. It punched through the thin hull plating and detonated inside the engine room. The destroyer seemed to lift out of the water, her back breaking, her bow and stern sagging as the center disintegrated. Larner didn't see it. He was already past, pulling up and banking hard to avoid the transport ship, looming directly ahead. Behind him, the other 7 B-25s were making their runs, each one a carbon copy of his own. Strafe, release, prey. The radio exploded with voices. Hit! Direct hit on the transport! Destroyer turning, coming about! I'm hit, losing hydraulics. Larner keyed the mic. All aircraft, continue attack runs. Focus on the transports. Because that was the calculus, cold and brutal. The destroyers were dangerous, but the transports carried the troops. 6,000 men packed into those cargo holds, heading to reinforce Leh. Every transport sunk meant hundreds, maybe thousands of enemy soldiers who would never reach the beach. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a chaos that no amount of training could prepare men for. Larner pulled Dirty Dora into a tight climbing turn, Morrison calling out airspeed and altitude, while Waskowitz reloaded the nose guns with shaking hands. Below them, the Japanese convoy was dissolving into panic and flame. The destroyer Tokitsukaze was already sinking, her stern pointing skyward as she slid beneath the waves. But 7 more destroyers remained, and they were maneuvering now with desperate precision, throwing up curtains of anti-aircraft fire that turned the air into a screaming metal storm. Lieutenant Ben's B-25, Margie's Mischief, made its run on the transport Kyokusei Maru. At 50 feet and 265 miles per hour, there was no room for error. Ben's forward guns raked the transport's deck, killing the anti-aircraft crews before they could track his approach. His skip, bombs hit the water perfectly, bouncing once, twice, and both slammed into the ship's waterline, amidships. The delay fuses worked exactly as designed, the bombs punching through the hull before detonating deep inside the cargo holds. What happened next wasn't in anyone's tactical projections. The Kyokusei Maru wasn't just carrying troops. She was loaded with ammunition, fuel drums, artillery shells. When Ben's bombs detonated, they triggered a secondary explosion that tore the transport literally in half. A mushroom cloud of fire rose 500 feet into the air. The shock wave was visible, a ripple of compressed air that rolled across the water. Ben barely escaped it, his B-25 bucking in the blast wave, one wing dipping so close to the water that spray soaked the gunner's position. Jesus Christ! Ben's voice crackled over the radio. The whole damn ship just exploded. But there was no time to celebrate. The Japanese destroyer Asagumo had broken from the defensive formation and was charging directly at the American bombers, all guns firing. Her captain, Commander Sato Minoru, was a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Java Sea. He understood instantly what the Americans were doing, and he knew the only counter. Aggressive, close engagement. Force the bombers to maneuver, break their attack runs. Destroyer approaching from stern, Morrison called out. Range closing fast. Larner banked hard, but the Asagumo's 5-inch guns tracked them with terrifying accuracy. A shell exploded 50 feet off their starboard wing, shrapnel peppering the fuselage. Another shell hit the water ahead of them, the geyser so close that Dirty Dora flew through the spray column. We need altitude, Morrison said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. Negative, we climb, we're dead, their heavy guns will bracket us. Larner kept the bomber at wave-top level, jinking left and right, making them as difficult to target as possible. We stay low, stay fast. It was madness. At 50 feet, a single mistake meant instant death. A moment's inattention, a control error, a mechanical failure, any of it would send them cartwheeling into the ocean at nearly 300 miles per hour. But altitude meant exposure to the destroyer's main batteries, guns, designed to hit targets miles away. Lieutenant Rhodes' bomber, Pacific Prowler, wasn't as lucky. Trying to line up on the transport Teo Maru, Rhodes flew directly into the overlapping fire from 2 destroyers. A 25mm shell punched through the cockpit canopy, killing his co-pilot instantly and shattering Rhodes' left arm. The B-25 wavered, dipping toward the water. "Prowler's hit!" someone shouted over the radio. "Rhodes is hit!" For 5 seconds that felt like eternity, the Pacific Prowler skimmed the wave tops with a dead co-pilot and a pilot rapidly going into shock from blood loss. Then, somehow, Rhodes pulled, the nose up with his one good arm, gained 50 feet of precious altitude, and steadied the bomber. "Still, in the fight," Rhodes gasped over the radio. His voice was tight with pain, but his bomber was still flying. "Making my run." It was the kind of courage that doesn't fit into official reports, the kind that happens when men are too stubborn, or too loyal, or too terrified to do anything except push forward. Rhodes lined, up on the Teo Maru with one arm, flying on instinct and rage, and released his skip bombs at point-blank range. Both bombs hit. The Teo Maru, already damaged from near misses, took the explosions below, her waterline. She began to list immediately, seawater pouring into her holds, where 800 Japanese soldiers were packed in darkness, listening to the battle rage above them. Larner brought Dirty Dora around for a second pass. Below, the convoy was in complete disarray. 3 transports were sinking or burning. 2 destroyers were damaged and falling behind the formation. But 5 destroyers remained combat effective, and 13 transport ships were still intact, still carrying thousands of troops toward Leh. "We need to keep hitting them," Larner said, mostly to himself. "Can't let them scatter." Morrison glanced at the fuel gauge. "Sir, we're at 60%. We keep this up, we won't make it back to Port Moresby." It was a choice Larner had known was coming. Fuel was finite. Ammunition was finite. The Japanese convoy was still overwhelmingly powerful. A rational commander would withdraw now, count the victories, and let the ships escape. But Larner kept seeing the intelligence estimates. 6,000 troops, maybe 8,000. Every transport that reached Leh meant more American soldiers dying in jungle warfare, outnumbered and outgunned. "One more pass," he said. "All aircraft, one more attack run, then we withdraw." What Larner didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his unauthorized low-level attack had already achieved something unprecedented. In the 15 years since aircraft had first attacked ships, no one had ever developed a consistently effective method for bombers to sink maneuvering vessels. The Japanese Navy had grown confident, almost arrogant, in the knowledge that their convoys were effectively immune to air attack. In 12 minutes, Larner and his 7 B-25s had shattered that assumption. On the bridge of the transport Ayo Maru, Captain Sugimoto Takeo watched the American bombers with mounting horror. He'd survived attacks before, sat through countless high-altitude bombing raids where Allied planes dropped their payloads from safety and hit nothing but ocean. This was different. These bombers were coming in so low he could see the pilots' faces. Their bombs didn't miss. They couldn't miss at that range. "All ships, emergency scatter protocol," Sugimoto screamed into the radio. "Break formation, individual evasion." It was the worst possible order, but also the only rational one. The tight defensive formation that had protected convoys for 18 months was now a killing ground. Ships bunched together made easier targets for skip bombing. Better to scatter, use speed and maneuverability, make the Americans chase individual targets. But scattered ships were vulnerable to submarines. Scattered ships lost the concentrated anti-aircraft fire that had kept Allied bombers at bay. Sugimoto was choosing between 2 nightmares. The convoy began to break apart, transport ships peeling away in different directions, destroyers trying to maintain some semblance of protective coverage. It was exactly what Larner had hoped for. "They're scattering," Waskowitz reported. "Formations breaking up." Larner smiled grimly. Scattered ships meant isolated targets, meant his bombers could engage without flying through overlapping fields of fire. "All aircraft, pick your targets, make this count." Lieutenant Ben selected the transport Shinai Maru, a 6,500-ton cargo ship trying to flee northeast at her maximum speed of 16 knots. From 7,000 feet, 16 knots looks fast. From 50 feet, with a B-25 closing at 265 miles per hour, the ship looked like it was standing, still. Ben's approach was textbook perfect, if there had been a textbook for what they were doing. "Come in from the stern quarter. strafe the deck to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Release the skip, bombs at exactly 200 yards. Pull up and away before the explosions. The Guinea Maru's anti-aircraft crews never had a chance. Ben's forward guns chewed through their positions, 50 caliber rounds turning gun shields into Swiss cheese. By the time his bombs hit the water, most of the Japanese gunners were dead or diving for cover. The first skip bomb hit the water, bounced, and slammed into the ship's stern just above the propeller. The explosion was catastrophic. The Guinea Maru's rudder disintegrated, her propeller, shaft bent, and seawater began flooding her engine room. She was crippled, dead in the water, already settling by the stern. On board were 1,200 soldiers of the Japanese 51st Division, veterans of fighting in China, now packed into the holds like cargo. When the bomb hit, the lights went out. In the darkness, in the chaos, as seawater began pouring in, panic took over. But we weren't there to see that. We were in the sky, where Lieutenant Samuel Morrison was calling out damage reports as other B-25s pressed their attacks. 6 o'clock, destroyer closing fast. Larner banked hard left, and the Japanese destroyer Yuki Kaze roared past their previous position, her deck guns firing continuously. The Yuki Kaze was legendary, would survive the entire war without being sunk, and her crew was proving why. They'd adapted to the American tactics with frightening speed, positioning themselves between the bombers and the transports, forcing the B-25s to fly through their fire. "We can't get clean shots with these destroyers running interference," Morrison said. Larner made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Then we go through them." He pointed Dirty Dora's nose directly at the Yuki Kaze. At 50 feet and 265 miles per hour, it was a game of chicken with 2,000 tons of armed warship. The Japanese destroyer didn't flinch, her forward guns tracking the approaching bomber with mechanical precision. Morrison's hand tightened on the co-pilot's controls. "Sir, they're not turning. They're not turning." "Neither are we," Larner said quietly. The gap closed to 600 yards, 500, 400. At 300 yards, Larner could see individual Japanese, sailors on the Yuki Kaze's deck, could see the muzzle flashes from their anti-aircraft guns, could see the tracers arcing directly toward his windscreen. At 200 yards, he opened fire with all 8 forward guns. The convergence of firepower was devastating. 50 caliber rounds hammered into the destroyer's bridge at point-blank range. Glass shattered, metal tore. Officers diving for cover or simply ceasing to exist under the onslaught. At 100 yards, Larner released his remaining bombs and pulled up hard. The B-25 screamed over the Yuki Kaze's superstructure, with maybe 20 feet of clearance, so close that Morrison could smell the smoke from the destroyer's guns. Behind them, the skip bombs hit the water, bounced, and missed. The Yuki Kaze's captain had turned hard to port at the last second, a desperate maneuver that saved his ship but left him out of position to protect the transports. "Clear," Waskowitz shouted. "We're clear." But the Yuki Kaze's anti-aircraft fire had found its mark. Red lights blazed across Dirty Dora's instrument panel. The number 2 engine was running rough, oil pressure dropping. Hydraulic fluid was spraying across the starboard wing. "We're hit," Morrison said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Multiple systems compromised." Larner checked their position. They were 40 miles from the nearest Allied airfield, running on a damaged engine, hydraulics failing. The smart play was to withdraw immediately, get the damaged bomber back to base before something catastrophic failed. Instead, he looked down at the convoy. 7 transports were burning or sinking now, but 9 remained intact, carrying thousands of troops. The battle had lasted 14 minutes. In 14 minutes, they'd inflicted more damage on a Japanese convoy than any previous air attack in the Pacific War. What could they do with 1 more minute? "Target the transports," Larner ordered. "Ignore the destroyers. Hit the troop ships." It was the coldest calculation of war. Those transports weren't just metal and machinery. They were crowded with human beings. Soldiers, yes, but also cooks and medics and clerks. 18-year-old conscripts from farming villages who'd never wanted this war. Men who wrote letters home and carried photographs of sweethearts and dreamed of surviving to see Japan again. And Larner was about to kill as many of them as possible. Lieutenant Rhodes, flying one-armed with his dead co-pilot slumped in the seat beside him, lined up on the transport Taimei Maru. His bombardier was wounded, his navigator was trying to stop the co-pilot's bleeding, and his aircraft was flying on rage and failing systems. But his bombs were still loaded, and his guns still fired. The Taimei Maru was trying to run, smoke pouring from her stacks as her engineers pushed the engines beyond their rated capacity. She was carrying 900 soldiers in her holds, packed so tightly they could barely move. When Rhodes' skip bombs hit her waterline, the explosions tore through 3 bulkheads. Seawater flooded in with the force of a tidal wave. In the holds, in the darkness, 900 men began to die. Some drowned quickly, others were trapped in air pockets, listening to the water rise, knowing exactly how many minutes they had left. A few made it to the deck, only to face the open ocean, with no rescue ships in sight, because the destroyers were still fighting off bombers and couldn't stop to pick up survivors. This is the part of war stories we don't like to talk about. The part where young men drown in darkness, screaming for mothers who will never know exactly how their sons died. The part where decisions made in 15 minutes of chaos create hours of suffering. But Larner couldn't think about that, couldn't afford to, because hesitation in combat gets you killed. And getting killed meant the remaining transports would escape, and their troops would reach Leh, and more American soldiers would die in the jungle fighting that followed. So he pushed the guilt down deep and focused on the tactical situation. 8 B-25s, 7 still combat effective, 9 transport ships remaining, dwindling ammunition and fuel. Japanese destroyers adapting to their tactics, positioning themselves more effectively, their anti-aircraft fire becoming more accurate as they learned to lead the low-flying bombers. The 15 minutes were almost up. The question that should haunt anyone hearing this story: at what point does tactical brilliance become mass killing? At what altitude does a soldier become a murderer? Drop a bomb from 10,000 feet, you never see the faces. Skip it across the water from 50 feet, you're close. Enough to see their eyes when they realize they're about to die. Does that distance matter? Does it change the morality of what you're doing? Think about that. Really think about it. And leave a comment below telling me where you draw that line, because I'm genuinely curious where people stand on this. Larner certainly didn't have time to philosophize. The number 2 engine on Dirty Dora was now actively smoking, temperature gauges redlining. Morrison had shut down fuel flow to prevent a fire, which meant they were flying on 3 engines instead of 4. The hydraulic failure meant the landing gear might not deploy when they reached base. Multiple control surfaces were damaged, making the bomber sluggish and difficult to handle. "Sir, we need to withdraw," Morrison said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a co-pilot doing his job, stating the obvious tactical reality that his commander was ignoring. "We're not going to make it back if we take any more damage." "Noted," Larner said, which wasn't an agreement. He keyed the radio. "All aircraft, status, report." The responses came back ragged, punctuated by static and the background roar of engines. "Margie's Mischief, 1 engine damaged, hydraulics at 40%, still combat effective. Pacific Prowler, co-pilot KIA, pilot wounded, navigation systems out, but I can still drop bombs, god damn it. Betty's Revenge, multiple hits, tail gunner wounded, systems nominal." One by one, the bombers reported in. 7 aircraft, 6 still fully functional despite damage, 1 flying on sheer stubbornness, and a one-armed pilot's refusal to quit. And below them, the Japanese convoy was dying. The destroyer Asagumo had taken a lucky hit from one of Lieutenant Ben's skip bombs. Not a direct hit. The bomb had skipped past the intended transport and caught the destroyer by accident. But lucky or not, the damage was catastrophic. The Asaguma was listing heavily to starboard, taking on water, her crew abandoning ship. That left 6 destroyers trying to protect 9 transports against 7 bombers that had abandoned all pretense of caution. The mathematics had shifted. The Japanese no longer had overwhelming defensive superiority. They had chaos, fear, and commanders who were making desperate decisions. Captain Sugimoto, on the bridge of the Io Maru, watched the Americans come around for what he prayed would be their final attack run. His ship had been lucky so far, avoiding the skip bombs through aggressive maneuvering, but his luck couldn't hold forever. No one's luck held forever. "Full speed!" he screamed at his engine room. "Give me everything!" The Io Maru was carrying 1,100 soldiers. Sugimoto had met some of them during the voyage, shared sake with officers who talked about their families back home. Good men, brave men, and Sugimoto was about to get them all killed because he couldn't outrun a B-25 Mitchell bomber. Larner selected the Io Maru for his final attack. She was one of the largest transports in the convoy, which meant she likely carried the most troops. Cold calculus, maximum impact, win. The war, 1 dead enemy soldier at a time. "Waskowitz, this is our last pass. Make it count." "Yes, sir," Waskowitz responded from the bombardier position. His voice was steady, professional, giving no indication of the fact that he was a 23-year-old kid from Brooklyn who'd been selling insurance 2 years ago and had never imagined he'd be responsible for killing hundreds of people. The approach was different this time. The Japanese gunners had learned. They were no longer shooting where the bombers were. They were shooting where the bombers were going to be. The anti-aircraft fire was terrifyingly accurate. A 25mm shell punched through Dirty Dora's port wing, leaving a hole you could throw a baseball through. Another shell exploded just off the nose, shrapnel clattering against the fuselage like deadly hail. "Steady," Larner said, as much to himself as to his crew. "Steady." The Io Maru was turning hard, trying to present the smallest possible target. Her captain was good, Larner thought distantly, knew his ship, knew how to maneuver. Under different circumstances, they might have been friends, might have shared stories over drinks about the absurdity of war. Instead, Larner was about to kill him. "Range 400 yards, Waskowitz called out. 350, 300. The forward guns opened up, tracers streaming across the narrowing gap. The Io Maru's anti-aircraft crews fired back with desperate courage, knowing they were about to die, but refusing to abandon their posts. "Bombs away!" The skip bombs hit the water perfectly, bounced once, bounced twice, slammed into the Io Maru's hull at the waterline, punching through the metal plating before the delay fuses detonated. The explosions were sequential, 1, 2, like a giant's fist punching holes in the ship's guts. Larner pulled up and away, banking hard to avoid the transport's superstructure. Behind him, the Io Maru was already listing, seawater pouring into her holds where 1,100 soldiers were about to start dying. Morrison was staring at the fuel gauges, doing calculations that didn't add up. "We're at 40% fuel. Port Moresby is 180 miles. We might make it." Might. Larner looked down one last time at the convoy, or what was left of it. 8 transport ships were sinking or dead in the water. Fires raged across the sea, spreading oil slicks burning like lakes of flame. Destroyers were circling frantically, trying to pick up survivors, but there were too many. Thousands of men in the water, swimming away from sinking ships, drowning in the burning oil, screaming for help that wouldn't come. 15 minutes of combat, approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers dead or about to be. The most devastatingly effective anti-shipping attack in the Pacific War to date. And it was all unauthorized. "All aircraft," Larner's voice was hoarse, exhausted. "Form up on me, we're going home." The 7 B-25s assembled into a ragged formation, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, flying, on damaged engines and sheer determination. Behind them, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. Ahead of them, Port Moresby and an uncertain reception. Because Lieutenant Robert Rhodes had asked the question that mattered: what happens when we get back? The flight back to Port Moresby took 3 hours and 22 minutes that felt like years. Dirty Dora was barely airworthy, vibrating so badly that Larner's hands went numb on the controls. The damaged engine occasionally coughed out black smoke, and Morrison had to constantly adjust the fuel mixture to keep the remaining 3 engines running. Lieutenant Rhodes' Pacific Prowler was in worse shape. Flying with one arm, a dead co-pilot, and bullet holes through half his control surfaces, Rhodes stayed in formation through sheer, bloody-minded willpower. Twice his bomber began to drift off course, and twice he corrected, refusing to ditch in the ocean when land was within reach. At 14:47 hours, the New Guinea coast appeared on the horizon. At 15:03 hours, Port Moresby's control tower made radio contact. "Unidentified aircraft, this is Port Moresby Tower. Identify yourself and state your situation." Larner keyed the mic, suddenly aware of how tired he was. "Tower, this is Major Larner, 90th Bombardment Group. 7 B-25s returning from combat operations over the Bismarck Sea. Request immediate landing clearance. Multiple aircraft damaged. Casualties aboard." There was a pause. When the controller's voice came back, it carried a strange tone. Confusion? Concern? "Major Larner, please confirm. You engaged the Japanese convoy?" "Affirmative. Convoy engaged and heavily damaged. Request landing clearance." Another pause, longer this time. Larner could imagine the chaos in the tower. Controllers trying to reach command. Officers being woken from afternoon naps. Someone frantically pulling the mission orders to confirm what was authorized. "Major, be advised. General Kenny wants to see you immediately upon landing. Proceed to main runway. Emergency crews standing by." Morrison glanced at Larner. That didn't sound like welcome home, heroes. "No," Larner agreed. It did not. The 7 B-25s landed in sequence, Dirty Dora touching down first despite her damage. The landing gear deployed. Morrison had been praying about that for the last 100 miles, and Larner brought the bomber to a stop with brake systems that were more prayer than hydraulics. Before the propellers had stopped spinning, before the crew could even climb out, a jeep roared up with military police. The MP captain looked grim. "Major Larner, you're to come with me immediately. General Kenny wants you in his office. Now." Larner climbed down from the bomber, his flight suit soaked with sweat, hands still shaking with adrenaline. Around him, emergency crews were swarming over the damaged aircraft. Medics were extracting Lieutenant Rhodes, who'd finally passed out from blood loss once he'd landed, safely. The dead co-pilot was being carried out of the Pacific Prowler's cockpit with whatever dignity they could manage. The jeep ride to headquarters took 4 minutes. 4 minutes for Larner to realize his career was likely over. 4 minutes to wonder if he'd be court-martialed. 4 minutes to decide he didn't care, because those transport ships were sinking, and their troops would never reach Leh. General George Kenny's office was exactly what you'd expect: Spartan, functional, dominated by a large map of the Pacific Theater, covered in colored pins representing friendly and enemy positions. Kenny himself was standing at the map, back to the door, studying it with the intensity of a man trying to read the future in the present's chaos. He didn't turn around when Larner entered. "Major," Kenny said quietly, "tell me about your mission." Larner stood at attention. "Sir, we engaged the Japanese convoy at approximately 10:30 hours. 8 B-25s conducted skip bombing attacks at wave-top altitude. We achieved direct hits on multiple transport ships. Estimated 8 transports sunk or critically damaged. At least 2 destroyers sunk or disabled. Estimated enemy casualties 3,000 or more. Skip bombing," Kenny said, "at wave-top altitude." "Yes, sir. Your orders specified high-altitude approach, 10,000 feet. Conventional bombing pattern." "Yes, sir. So you directly disobeyed those orders." This was it, the moment where Larner's career ended. He'd known it was coming since the moment he dropped Dirty Door at 50 feet. "Yes, sir. I made a tactical decision in the field that—" Kenny turned around. He wasn't angry, he was smiling. "You just changed how we fight this entire goddamn war," the general said. Larner blinked. "Sir? I've been trying to convince the brass that skip bombing could work for 6 months. 6 months of arguing, of tactical papers, of demonstration runs that didn't convince anyone. You know what convinces people, Major? Results." Kenny walked to his desk, pulled out a folder. "We've been getting radio intercepts from the Japanese convoy, or what's left of it. They're in complete panic, screaming about a new American attack method, calling it unstoppable. Sir, I violated direct orders. Your men just sunk more enemy ships in 15 minutes than the entire 5th Air Force has managed in the last 6 months." Kenny's smile faded slightly. "Don't misunderstand me, Major. You did violate orders. You put your men at risk using untested tactics. By every regulation in the book, I should court-martial you." Larner's stomach dropped. "But regulations are written by people who've never flown combat missions at 50 feet, who've never had to make impossible decisions with incomplete information and lives hanging in the balance." Kenny sat down, suddenly looking tired. "You made the right call, the hard call, the call that's going to save thousands of Allied lives, because those Japanese reinforcements are never reaching Leh. So, I'm not being court-martialed." "Oh, you're definitely getting reprimanded, officially, for the record, so the brass back in Washington can pretend we follow proper chain of command." Kenny's smile returned. "Unofficially, you're getting a medal, and you're going to train every bomber squadron in the Pacific how to do what you just did." The relief was physical, almost overwhelming. Larner's knees went weak, and he had to lock them to stay standing. "There's something else," Kenny said, his voice going quiet. "The casualty estimates, 3,000 men. Maybe more when all the ships go down. That's a lot of people to kill in 15 minutes, Major." "Yes, sir." "How do you feel about that?" Larner thought about the faces he'd seen on the Io Maru's deck. The Japanese sailors, scrambling for cover. The certainty that thousands of men were drowning right now in the Bismarck Sea because of decisions he'd made. "Honestly, sir, I don't know. Ask me in 10 years. Kenny nodded slowly. "That's probably the healthiest answer you could give. The men who feel nothing worry me. The men who feel too much can't function. But the men who know they'll have to process it later, those are the ones who might stay sane." He stood up, extended his hand. "Dismissed, Major. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start planning the next strike." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea didn't end with Larner's landing. It continued for 3 more days as Allied aircraft hunted down the scattered remnants of the convoy. By March 5, 1943, the final tally was devastating. All 16 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,600 Japanese soldiers killed. Only 850 survivors pulled from the water. The Japanese would never attempt another major convoy to New Guinea. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Numbers don't capture what it meant. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff absorbed the catastrophic loss in silence. An entire division, gone. Thousands of tons of supplies and ammunition at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The Strategic Initiative in New Guinea lost permanently. They classified the disaster as top secret, forbidding any public mention. Japanese civilians would never learn how completely their forces had been destroyed. In Port Moresby, Larner spent 3 weeks training other bomber crews in skip bombing tactics. Young pilots who'd been dropping bombs from safe altitudes suddenly had to learn to fly at wave-top level, so close to the water they could count the whitecaps. Some couldn't do it. The psychological barrier was too great. Flying that low, that fast, required suppressing every survival instinct evolution had given you. But enough pilots could do it. Enough bombardiers learned the timing. Enough crews mastered the terrible mathematics of skip bombing. By summer of 1943, it was standard tactics throughout the Pacific theater. The Japanese Navy, which had owned the seas for 18 months, suddenly found their convoys vulnerable in ways they'd never imagined. Lieutenant Rhodes recovered from his wounds, lost the arm, but kept flying combat missions. He'd finished the war with 38 missions, all of them flown with one arm and a co-pilot he trusted completely. When people asked him about it, he'd shrug and say, "You only need one arm to drop bombs." Lieutenant Ben was killed 7 months later in a raid over Rabaul. His bomber took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire and disintegrated in mid-air. He was 23. His final letter home talked about how proud he was of what they'd accomplished in the Bismarck Sea, how many Allied lives they'd saved by stopping that convoy. Captain Sugimoto survived the sinking of the Io Maru. He spent 18 hours in the water before a Japanese destroyer picked him up. Of the 1,100 soldiers on his transport, 243 survived. Sugimoto would spend the rest of his life wondering what he could have done differently, replaying those 15 minutes, searching for the tactical decision that would have saved his ship. He never found it. Pappy Gunn, the engineer who'd modified the B-25s, became a legend in the Pacific theater. His gun modifications and tactical innovations saved countless lives. He survived the war and lived to see his grandchildren, telling them stories about the crazy pilots who'd been brave enough or foolish enough to test his theories. And Major Ed Larner? He flew combat missions until the war ended, got his medal, a Distinguished Service Cross that came with a reprimand letter that was promptly filed and forgotten. Trained hundreds of pilots in skip bombing tactics, watched as the method he'd pioneered became doctrine, codified in official tactical manuals, taught at flight schools. After the war, he rarely talked about the Bismarck Sea. When pressed, he'd acknowledge the tactical significance, the strategic impact, the lives saved by preventing those Japanese reinforcements from reaching Leh. But he never celebrated it, never bragged about the 3,000 men killed in 15 minutes. In 1967, a historian interviewing him about the battle asked, "Do you think you made the right decision? Disobeying orders, using untested tactics, killing all those men?" Larner was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I made a decision. In war, that's all you can do. Make the best decision you can with the information you have, and live with the consequences." The right decision? Ask the Allied soldiers who didn't have to fight 6,000 additional enemy troops at Leh. Ask the Japanese families who lost sons in the Bismarck Sea. You'll get different answers. But what's your answer? The historian pressed. My answer is, I'm still here, still breathing, still trying to figure out how to live with 15 minutes of decisions that killed 3,000 people and saved thousands more. Larner lit a cigarette with hands that still, 24 years later, occasionally shook. You want moral clarity? Watch A Different War. This one doesn't have any. The unauthorized B-25 attack on March 3, 1943, killed approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers in 15 minutes of combat. It also prevented those soldiers from reinforcing Leh, which likely saved thousands of Allied lives. It revolutionized anti-shipping tactics and changed the strategic balance of the Pacific War. It was accomplished by men who violated direct orders because they believed, rightly, as it turned out, that following those orders would lead to greater tragedy. History calls it the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, calls it a decisive Allied victory, calls it a turning point in the Pacific theater. All of that is true, but it was also 8 bomber crews making impossible decisions at 50 feet and 265 miles per hour, close enough to see the faces of the men they were about to kill, knowing that hesitation meant different people would die instead. There's no Hollywood ending here, no clear heroes and villains, just men and machines making terrible choices, living with the consequences. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the impossible decisions people make in impossible situations, then share it. Subscribe to this channel because stories like this complicated, uncomfortable, true. These are the ones that deserve to be told. Not the sanitized versions, not the simple narratives, the messy, difficult truth of what war actually asks of people. Ed Larner died in 1982. His obituary mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross, mentioned his role in developing skip bombing tactics, mentioned his 38 combat missions. It didn't mention the nightmares he occasionally had about flying at 50 feet over the Bismarck Sea, close enough to see faces he'd never forget. Some weights you carry until you can't anymore. Some decisions you make in 15 minutes echo for 40 years. That's the unauthorized attack that killed 3,000 men in 15 minutes. That's the decision that changed a war. That's the story they don't tell you when they talk about heroes.